Welcome to Storyteller's Hearth Fireside Tales' conclusion of Isabella, the she-wolf of France. In previous episodes, we saw she was born in 1295 to the iron-willed Philip IV of France. Isabella of France was no ordinary princess. She was a descendant of conquerors, raised in the Louvre's glittering court and educated among Europe's finest minds. At just 12, she was married to England's King Edward II in a lavish ceremony that quickly revealed her humiliation. Her new husband's obsession with his favourite, Piers Gaveston, whose arrogance eclipsed her at every turn. Ignored and scorned, the young queen endured years of neglect, watching as Gaveston flaunted her jewels and Edward dismissed her like a political burden. After Gaveston's brutal execution by rebellious barons in 1312, Isabella briefly hoped for reconciliation, only for Edward to replace Gaveston with the even more dangerous Hugh Despenser the Younger. By the 1320s, the Despensers had seized her lands, stolen her children, and reduced her to poverty, mocking her with the offer of a single penny for upkeep. When Edward, fearing French retaliation, sent her to negotiate peace with her brother, Charles IV, Isabella seized her chance. Refusing to return to her gilded cage, she rallied exiled nobles and plotted her revenge, with the help of the dashing rebel Roger Mortimer. Now, in Episode 3, Isabella's Revenge, the stage is set. The she-wolf of France will return as she had promised, not as a beggar, but as a conqueror. If you like this video, please like, and if you want to see more like it, subscribe to our channel. The Tower of London had failed to break him. Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, 1st Earl of March, stood in the dim light of a Parisian great room, turning a dagger between his fingers. His face was illuminated by the firelight, the same face that had descended the Tower of London's walls on a rope 2 years prior, slipping into the Thames mist like a spirit. Roger was a man of blood and legend. Through his veins ran the ambition of kings, descended from King John of Magna Carta fame on his father's side, and from Crusader kings and emperors on his mother's. His uncle, Roger Mortimer de Chierc, had been the one to deliver the severed head of his own cousin, Llewellyn ap Griffith, to Edward I. See our video, The Lion and the Rose, the love story of Llewellyn and Eleanor. The Mortimers were never just mere subjects. They were powerful barons of the marches and kingmakers. And now he was a fugitive, standing with his queen in Paris. In 1304, when Roger was just 17, his father had been killed in a skirmish with the Welsh while overseeing construction of one of his castles, leaving the boy lord of his father's vast marcher lands. Since Roger was underage and therefore a ward of the king, Edward I immediately placed the lad under the guardianship of Piers Gaveston. This was the same Gaveston he had assigned to serve as a companion and mentor to his own son, Prince Edward, the future Edward II. At first, Edward I had seen Gaveston as a refined and charismatic figure. But when the young prince grew too close to his friend, Gaveston's growing insubordination and swagger began to raise alarm bells with the court. The breaking point came when Gaveston and Prince Edward, amidst widespread rumours of their having an intimate relationship, gave insulting nicknames to the most powerful members of the royal court. While this was not an uncommon pastime among silly pubescent young nobles, these two crossed the line when they disrespectfully dismissed the battle-hardened Edward Longshanks, King Edward I of England, Hammer of the Scots, by calling him the Old Boar, mocking his perceived waning relevance and advancing age. Edward I then exiled Roger's guardian from England, where he remained until the king's death. Roger Mortimer had stood in a place of honour at Edward II's coronation, a reward for his years of friendship and loyalty. But years later, his allegiance to young Edward had abruptly died when Hugh Despenser the Younger began encroaching on his power and influence. In 1321, Mortimer led the Marcher Lords in a revolt against King Edward II and the Despensers in what became known as the Despenser War. His main grievance was Hugh Despenser's calculated land grabs that seemed to always improve his own position, including his claim of lordship over Roger's land in South Wales. For a brief, glorious moment, the insurrectionists seemed to win, and by August 7th, 1321, they forced Edward to exile the Despensers when it became clear to the king he had little military support left for his cause. But then in early 1322, Edward, betraying his agreement with the rebel nobles, secretly recalled the Despensers and launched a lightning military campaign, defeating the dissident forces piecemeal. By January, Mortimer and his uncle, Roger Mortimer de Chirk, with fortunes suddenly reversed, surrendered to the king at Shrewsbury and were sent to the Tower of London under heavy guard. They were both initially sentenced to death, but because of their high status and powerful family connections, their sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. However, the insurgents' vast estates were confiscated by the crown and given to the Despensers and other fawning favourites. Edward had meant the Tower to be their tomb, but young Mortimer did not plan to stay long. On the 1st of August 1323, after less than 2 years in prison, he staged his now famous daring escape. He allegedly bribed and drugged his guards, and then, using ropes smuggled in by allies, climbed down the walls of the tower and fled to France. The details of his escape are somewhat murky, but most historians agree Roger Mortimer almost certainly had assistance from corrupt or sympathetic Tower staff. The Anonymal Chronicle says Mortimer hosted a feast for his guards, where he drugged their wine with a sleeping potion. Once the guards were unconscious, he removed a stone from his cell wall and slipped out onto the roof, from where he rappelled down the wall to an awaiting boatman on the River Thames. Surprisingly, despite Edward II being furious, no Tower staff were ever disciplined for this shocking breach in security. Roger Mortimer of Chirk, however, did not join him and remained in captivity, where he died in 1326. Now, for the past 2 years after his escape, he had been a wolf without a pack until Isabella arrived in France. The French court buzzed when Isabella rode into Paris. As Edward II's queen, sent to negotiate peace over Aquitaine and Gascony, she should have been a supplicant. Instead, she held herself like a sovereign. Mortimer watched her from the shadows. She had been humiliated, robbed, and cast aside just as he was. When their eyes met, he saw in her a potential ally. At first, the conspirators convened in secret. Maps of England spread between them. Isabella had surrounded herself with a group of formerly powerful English exiles, including Edmund of Kent, John of Brittany, and Roger Mortimer of Wigmore. Outside, the rain lashed the windows like the ghosts of their pasts. Llewellyn's head on a pike, Gaveston's headless corpse on Blacklow Hill, and Despenser's laughter as he seized their estates. Isabella of France was introduced to Roger Mortimer in Paris by her cousin and future daughter-in-law, Joan of Valois, and soon formed a bond over their shared interests in Arthurian legends, fine art, courtly culture, and most of all, a deep hatred of Hugh Despenser. As Isabella and the English exiles' schemes became more public, King Charles faced increasing diplomatic pressure from Edward II to send Isabella and Prince Edward home and to arrest Mortimer as an escaped convict. The Vita Eduardi Secundi noted that Charles was growing increasingly impatient with Isabella's defiance of her husband. Amid rumours of a romantic relationship developing between Isabella and Roger, French chroniclers suggest Charles gave Mortimer an ultimatum to leave France or face arrest. Compelled by both political necessity and safety concerns, Isabella and Roger withdrew from the French court in late 1325 and sought refuge with Joan's husband, Count William I of Hainaut in Flanders, accompanied by a small but loyal retinue made up of Isabella's trusted ladies-in-waiting, clerks, and a handful of English exiles like Sir John of Hainaut, the Count's brother, and a small group of knights and agents who had joined Roger in his flight to France. While under the protection of Count William, Isabella continued negotiations that had possibly started in France for a marriage alliance between Philippa and Prince Edward. By the spring of 1326, the terms were agreed. Philippa's dowry would include ships, mercenaries, and funds for an invasion of England, and by August 1326, the two were formally betrothed, binding Edward, aged 13, to Philippa, aged 12. In addition to Philippa's dowry, Isabella secured a loan from her brother, King Charles, which she used to hire a mercenary Flemish army. On 24th September 1326, Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer set sail from Dordrecht with a force of an estimated 1,500 men-at-arms, accompanied by Prince Edward and Henry, Earl of Lancaster. While their fleet managed to avoid Edward II's patrols sent to intercept them, they became lost, eventually landing in the River Orwell in Suffolk. Not sure where they were, the invading force initially wandered around trying to find their bearings. Upon news of their arrival, a local militia was sent to oppose them, but immediately switched sides, joining Isabella in her rebellion. As news spread of the approaching army, London citizens began to rise up in support of the Queen, and Edward II, realizing the city would not offer him any protection, fled for his life towards his friends in Bristol. But Isabella and Roger were in hot pursuit, with their army growing in numbers all along the way. In each city, Isabella was greeted as a saviour. In Bristol, the Despenser stronghold, she was able to rescue her two daughters, who had been held by Despenser. Hugh Despenser the elder was captured and promptly cut to pieces and fed to the dogs by his enraged enemies. But Edward and his favourite had managed to cross into Cymru. After a couple of weeks of evading capture in South Wales, the king was finally caught on November 16th, 1326. Hugh Despenser the younger, who was captured while attempting to flee, was pulled from his horse, stripped naked, and had appropriate biblical verses carved into his skin. He was then dragged into the city, past jeering crowds that threw filth at him, to be presented to the new royal court. Charged with treason, tyranny, corruption, and sodomy, Hugh was sentenced to be partially hanged from a 50-foot gallows, cut down before death, castrated and disemboweled alive as punishment for his alleged unnatural relationship with Edward II. His entrails were then burned before his eyes, before his heart was cut out and thrown into a fire. As a final deprivation, he was beheaded, his body quartered, and his head displayed on London Bridge. By December 1326, Isabella and Roger Mortimer had assumed effective control of the English crown. Edward II, now imprisoned, was compelled to abdicate in favour of his son, Prince Edward, who was crowned Edward III in February 1127. Isabella was named regent for her teenage son, wielding immense power alongside her alleged lover, Mortimer. Despite their victory, their rule was not without challenges. Discontent soon began simmering among the barons, who bristled under Mortimer's influence and the perception of his growing arrogance. Whispers of their illicit relationship continued to tarnish Isabella's reputation, and as her former supporters watched her enriching herself at the country's expense, they began to question her motives. Both Mortimer and Isabella, emboldened by their newfound power, began to consolidate wealth and titles for themselves, alienating many of those who had once rallied to their cause. Had they replaced one tyrannical pair with another? King Edward II, who had been held in the custody of Henry of Lancaster, was condemned to life in house arrest. However, on September 23rd, Edward II died of a fatal accident. While many fanciful and colourful rumours spread like wildfire across Europe, no proof exists as to what happened to the king. Among the populace, Isabella was still revered as the she-wolf of France, a figure of both admiration and fear. During this period, Isabella raided the royal treasury and used her powers to accumulate so much land and wealth as to become the richest woman in the kingdom. In her obsession for accumulating land, she even refused to give up her dower lands to Philippa, which were rightfully hers upon becoming queen. However, the political tide began to turn as Edward III matured. By 1330, the young king, eager to assert his authority and escape his mother's clutches, orchestrated a dramatic coup. Mortimer was captured, accused of treason, and executed, while Isabella was allowed to retire to a life of comparative obscurity. While much of her ill-gotten wealth was confiscated, she lived a comfortable life in her own castle, developing a very close relationship with her daughter Joan. She seemed to become more religious as she got older, taking on the nun's habit of the Poor Clares before she died on 22nd August 1358. Isabella's rebellion and the brief rule she shared with Mortimer left an indelible mark on English history. Their story, a blend of ambition, betrayal, and retribution, became the stuff of legends, a warning woven into the fabric of England's tumultuous medieval past. This concludes our 3-episode series of Isabella the She-Wolf of France. If you enjoyed these videos, please like and share. If you would like to see more of these types of stories, please subscribe to our channel.